Dr. Keith Villa joins me this week to discuss his long career in brewing and also his new efforts brewing non-alcoholic beers. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 265. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 265, and it's early September 2022. Dr. Keith Villa joins me this week to discuss his long career in beer brewing and also his new efforts brewing non-alcoholic beers. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with a new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith forum a few weeks ago, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Dr. Keith Villa, co-founder of Syria Brewing Company. Keith retired from a 32-year career with Miller's Coors, where he was the brewmaster for Blue Moon. He then launched Syria Brewing in 2018, which focuses on full-bodied, alcohol-free craft beer. He also wrote the book, Brewing with Cannabis. Keith, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Doing fine, Brad. Thanks for having me on. And hopefully we can talk about home brewing NA beer, and have some fun here.
Well, it's interesting to me. You started out as a home brewer 36 years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, about 1982-ish in college. Yeah. It's because, as you probably know, the headquarters for home brewing, the American Homebrewers Association, is right there in Boulder.
Yes.
And I went to school. My undergrad was at University of Colorado Boulder, and I remember one time I was walking on the Pearl Street Mall, and at the end of the mall was the headquarters for the AHA.
No
and
kidding.
I remember they would hand out pamphlets and stuff, and in those days, I didn't think you could make beer at home because I'm kind of old. I'm dating myself here, but when I was in college, I started in 81, then 82 is when I took up home brewing as a hobby. And a lot of folks don't realize that prior to 1978, home brewing was actually illegal here in the United States.
Right.
It's under, I think it was Jimmy Carter's administration that it became legal. So that was 78, 79, 80, 81, 82. So 4 years later in 82 is when I started. And that's why I really didn't think you could brew at home. And I remember seeing these people handing out pamphlets on the Pearl Street Mall saying, learn to brew and all this. And at first I thought they were just a bunch of Jesus freaks hanging out there. And you get closer and it's like, wait, no, these people are, they call themselves home brewers. What is that? And you go and check it out. And of course, I took it up as a hobby and never looked back. It's a fun hobby.
You probably had, so I started in 87, a few years after you, but I assume you had Charlie Papazian's book, right?
The Complete Joy of Home Brewing, Volume 1.
Yeah.
Well, back then, I think it was just Complete Joy of Home Brewing. So, yeah.
But you pursued a career in brewing, right?
That is absolutely correct. I never thought I would do it, but when I graduated, or right before I graduated from University of Colorado, my undergraduate degree was molecular biology, and I had planned on going to medical school and becoming a pediatrician. So I worked really hard as an undergrad, and I co-authored a couple of papers, which in those days, that was quite an accomplishment because undergrads generally did not publish anything. But I worked in a laboratory. I co-authored 2 articles. I just worked as hard as I could so that I could get into medical school. And surprisingly, a couple months before graduation in molecular biology as an undergrad, Coors put a big advertisement up in the laboratory where I was working, and it said that they were looking for someone to do brewing and fermenting research, and they needed somebody with molecular biology experience. And the lab I was working in was exactly what they were looking for. And so I went and talked to them, and I thought, this could be interesting because it's my hobby. It's my homebrewing is my hobby, so I might as well go check this out. And I did, and they said I was the most qualified out of, I think there might have been 70 or 80 students who went over there to the Coors Brewery, and they said they'd like to have me the day after I graduated, and that's when I had to ask myself if I wanted to go to medical school and work with sick people or work with beer. And I thought, well, I'll try beer for a year or two, and if I don't like it, I'll head to medical school. So that was my plan, and I did it for a couple of years and fell in love with brewing and brewing research. And so, I never looked back, and ended up telling them that I was going to quit and go back to Boulder to get my PhD in biochemistry so I can continue doing research. And they said, well, we have a connection with a professor at the University of Brussels in Belgium who has an opening for a doctoral candidate. And they said, if you want to go there, we'd pay your way and all this. And I said, sure. So I went to Belgium and got my PhD in brewing. And it's funny because Belgium is a semi-socialized country. So the yearly tuition to get a PhD over there at the University of Brussels ended up being about $98. So
wow.
It was
probably a little higher now, but yeah.
Yeah. Pretty good deal.
Yeah. So you gave up med school for brewing, and then the other thing I want to mention is you were the keynote speaker at this year's homebrew convention with the AHA, right?
That's right, in Pittsburgh this year, and I had a lot of fun there. I gave two talks: the opening keynote, and then I gave a talk on brewing with cannabis, and I heard a lot of great feedback. A lot of people were really interested in kind of the history of what I did, like with Blue Moon and everything. And so it was a great time. It's been a long time since I've been to Pittsburgh, and always a great city to get back to, especially with all the new beers that are the brewers and everything. It's just a wonderful environment, and the weather was fantastic.
Yeah, it was. I really enjoyed it as well. Well, before we dive into your recent projects, why don't you tell us a little bit about your 32 years at Miller Coors? You started out doing molecular biology, but I think over time you evolved into doing other things, right?
Yeah, I started out doing research with the yeast, doing molecular biology. By that, what I was doing was actually trying to improve the yeast, the brewer's yeast over there, using modern genetics, not classic. Over the years, I did some classical genetic work there, but what I was trying specifically to do was clone new genes into the yeast to get them to do new things. For example, cloning in a gene to produce glucoamylase, so that the yeast can produce glucoamylase on its own, and you wouldn't have to add it exogenously, and therefore you could save quite a bit of money in enzyme costs every year. So I did that and created some other strains of yeast with improved ester formation. Just lots of projects like that with the yeast. And of course, in the brewing world, it's pretty conservative. So the strains I created, I believe, are still in liquid nitrogen, and maybe they'll be there for a long, long time because, the brewers industry is very, very conservative. But it is interesting. It's improving in the craft side because recently there have been some strains of yeast available to craft brewers, and I believe home brewers too, that really allow for the biotransformation of hop compounds. So you get these really nice thiol compounds in it, and you get some fantastic dry hop and hop aromas in beer by using these genetically modified yeasts.
Yeah, I had John Palmer on last week, and we were talking about that. And Stan Hieronymus was on before talking about something very similar, where trying to enhance the thiols and enhance the biotransformations that happen, particularly at the end of fermentation, seems to be a popular topic now. And I know there are several commercial yeast strains out that are available. Yes, they are available to homebrewers as well, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and homebrewers are really, I think, the sharp end of the spear when it comes to experimenting and coming up with really novel new ideas. Because, as I said in my keynote, homebrewers really, at the end of the day, they've got a 5 gallon or 10 gallon batch, and if it turns out to be something they really don't like, it goes down the drain and they can start again, or they could just park it in an aging tank and let it age a long time, and then check it out later. Whereas craft brewers don't have that luxury. If they make a 2 barrel, 5 barrel, 10 barrel batch of product, in general, they've got to sell it to make money off it. They can't just dump it down the drain. And because at those volumes also, you're talking about some significant costs that add up over time in waste treatment. And they've got to sell it and make money. And that's why a lot of craft brewers are hesitant to really do some way out crazy ideas, whereas home brewers, it's like, bring it on. With that 5 gallon pot, they'll do almost anything.
And I would assume Miller Coors probably can't afford to experiment too much either, right?
Not with crazy ideas, no. Because I remember at Blue Moon, I started it in 1995, launched it September 14th, 1995. And of course, it grew to become really popular. But at the same time, it was part of Coors. And so the issue was that, I could never make any, or I guess I could, but I could never release to the public for sale any products that I worked on that had allergens. For example, peanut butter ale. I created a really nice peanut butter ale made in, I think I did the first one in 1996. Mm-hmm. And it was, I tested it, and I thought it was great because my initial goal I set for myself was, okay, I want to make a black and tan the Blue Moon way, which is kind of off the wall type of way. And as your listeners know, black and tan is typically a nice heavy ale, and then you top it off with a light stout like Guinness, mm-hmm. and you have this really beautiful black and tan beer. And I thought, okay, in that time, I remember we had a really nice raspberry cream ale that was pretty heavy, and I thought, what better flavor to go with raspberries than peanut butter? And so I put together a recipe for a peanut butter ale. It was a blonde ale brewed with peanut butter, and I tested a bunch of different peanut butters. There was Peter Pan, Jiffy, Skippy,
yeah,
Skippy. The one that turned out the best was Jif creamy peanut butter. It made the beer taste like nice roasted peanuts, and it was really a nice character. And so I did that, and I made black and tans. And I remember testing it at Coors Field, where I launched Blue Moon, mm-hmm. during one of the Colorado Rockies baseball games. And I remember the folks coming in, and I would say, do you want to try a new Brewmaster's Special? And of course, I had to say it contained peanuts because it's an allergen.
Yeah.
And most people said, yeah, I'll try that. And so they did. And it was funny because the one comment that almost everybody had after they drank it, and I'd walk up and say, what'd you think? Virtually all of them said the same thing. They would say, wow, that beer's not as bad as I thought it would be. And I thought that's not a great marketing slogan.
For, yeah.
Try this new peanut butter ale from Blue Moon. It's not as bad as you think it is. So I put that recipe in the archives.
You can put that on the label, right?
Yeah. But it's funny because that was 1996, and then I rolled it out again 10 years later, 2006, at the GABF, the Great American Beer Festival.
Sure.
And it was crazy because we had a line of people, must have been 50 people long, waiting for peanut butter ale. So the market in 10 years had gone from really thinking it's crazy to waiting in line to try this thing called peanut butter ale. And then, of course, at GABF, there were so many crazy ideas that just popped up over the years, whether it was from us or other brewers, and it just became a place to really showcase really cool exploratory ideas in the world of brewing. So, yeah, it's my career has been really fun as far as I'm concerned in coming up with some real creative, extreme beers back then before they knew what to call them.
Well, you were one of the original founders and brewmaster at Blue Moon. Can you tell us how Blue Moon Brewing Company came about?
Sure. I got back from Belgium, getting my PhD. Coors actually sent me, and I got back. It was got back in '92, and then in '94, that's when the folks at Coors said this whole micro brewing thing is really coming on, and we should probably get into it. And of course, in those days, they didn't say craft brewing; it was microbrewed beers. And so that's when I presented and came up with this concept that eventually became Blue Moon. We didn't have a name for it, but and that was actually our administrative assistant. She's the one who came up with the name because by the time we were ready to submit the paperwork and all that, we had been pulling out our hair trying to figure out a name. And Vivi came up to us and said, "You know what? You've got these recipes for these great beers, and you're backed by this big brewery." She said, "An opportunity like this only comes around once in a lifetime." She said, "Once in a blue moon. Why don't you call it Blue Moon Brewing Company?" And of course, I thought, I should have thought of that. Why didn't I think of that? And so, but we rolled with that name, and it took off. It was catchy. It was a perfect bar call in a crowded bar and everything. So we launched. And the funny part is people at the beginning, most people think Blue Moon was this huge success, but it wasn't. It almost died several times because the folks at Coors didn't. Yeah, there were a lot of times when they said it was kind of this small brand that kept getting in the way. It was expensive. When they had big brands like Coors Light and Coors, and in those days, Killian's, and they even had another specialty thing called Zima, which was a huge brand back then.
What happened to Zima?
Well, it's funny because
for those who don't know, Zima, many people listening probably wouldn't know, but Zima was clear beer, right?
It was the forerunner to a lot of these coolers, these malt coolers. So and so Zima was I believe the first, and it was almost not almost. It did have some adjunct, but it was a malt based cooler. And prior to that, the wine coolers were big, but Zima came on, and it was the first malt based cooler, and it got to somewhere between 1 and 2 million barrels a year. It was a big brand, very profitable. And when I started Blue Moon, I remember all the focus was on Zima, and then Coors Light, and Coors, and then Killian's, and it was tough to get any kind of funding for Blue Moon. And in fact, I couldn't brew Blue Moon in the Golden facility. I had to find a place, a craft brewery that had capacity, and so I brewed it the first couple of years up in Utica, New York, at the Saranac Brewery because they had capacity. Kidding. Yeah, they were a great. They still are a great facility.
Yeah, Saranac Brewing has been around for a long time, obviously. So.
Yes, and family owned and operated. To this day, there's still a Matt. Fred Matt is in charge. When I first did the brewing of Blue Moon back in the '90s, it was his dad, FX Matt, Francis Xavier Matt II, who we signed contracts with, and but that's where I brewed Blue Moon for the first couple of years, and then we outgrew that facility, so I moved it to Cincinnati, Ohio, the Hudipole Shaneling Brewery, and then eventually they got bought by Sam Adams, Boston Beer, and I didn't want them to have. Yeah. They would have had full access to all the Blue Moon recipes, and so I said, nope, this can't work. And so I moved it to Memphis, Tennessee, and brewed it there. And then finally in 2005, 10 years after I launched, that's when it became a big brand. And Coors did some work and said, let's test and see if we can brew it in the Golden Brewery, because they were really deathly afraid of cross-contamination of spices or yeast or wheat or oats getting into Coors Light or Coors. So, and I don't blame them, because in those days, these type of beers with spices weren't widely produced. And so, but they did some tests and put some strong quality parameters around the process, and figured out that we could brew Blue Moon successfully in Golden. So we moved production to Golden in 2005,
Mm-hmm.
And then it just kept growing. But the first 6 years, 1995 to 2001, that's when it was really tough because the folks at Coors tried to kill off Blue Moon several times. I remember my variety pack, they tried killing that off. They tried in little ways just to keep cutting packaging and killing it off. But every time they would try, I'd figure out a way to keep it alive and keep it growing, and call in favors with distributors or whatever I had to do. And eventually in 2001, that's when it hit critical mass and just started taking off. And we couldn't make enough. We were selling every little drop of Blue Moon we could make. But in the same time, the sales of Killian's really dropped. And Zima, that was everybody thought that would be this massive new brand, those sales tanked to the point where Zima, I think it was 2005 or six, somewhere in that period, where Zima was finally killed off because it had shrunk to a shadow of its former self, and there was just no option for the big brewery but to kill off the Zima brand. And then Killian's, it peaked out at a pretty big brand of maybe 500,000 barrels a year, but it too kept shrinking, and it's still available, but a very small brand. And Blue Moon is a big brand. It's well, it grew to become the biggest craft beer brand in the U.S. And by craft, I'm just throwing that out there. Some people have the BA definition of craft. Others have just the widespread market definition of craft. And
I assume your intention with Blue Moon was to compete directly with a lot of the craft breweries coming up, right?
That's it exactly. And from a consumer's perspective, I remember we did some tests with consumers, and you'd present them with different brands and different beers, and as long as it was different, they said, "Oh, that's craft." But over the years, most consumers would say, besides being different, they eventually started going towards every IPA was called craft beer, and I would argue that in today's world, there's quite a few consumers who would probably just say, "What's craft beer?" "Oh, it's IPA." A lot probably aren't familiar with all those rich styles of beer that brewers make. And so I think that's why it's so important for home brewers to get out there and make these styles and keep them relevant, because craft brewers, they have to stay in business. At the end of the day, they've got to pay their bills and keep the lights on and everything. And so they have to sell stuff that people will want to buy. And IPA is something people want to buy, but some of the way out there styles that won't sell, there's craft breweries who won't gamble with that, because the sales of craft beer have gone down over the last few years to a point where, some of them have had to offer hard seltzers, and that didn't end up well, because the whole hard seltzer market has now been really soft for the last couple of years.
Right.
Particularly right now, it's really soft. And now craft brewers are trying to get into non-alcoholic beer and anything they can just to pay the bills and keep those lights on. And so, again, I point to homebrewers as being the ones who carry the torch of innovation forward.
Interesting. So, I didn't know I know a lot of craft breweries got hit really hard with COVID, particularly those serving out of the tap room. But you're saying that they've also, just in general, craft beer sales are down, right?
Oh, yeah. Craft beer sales are definitely down. When you look at the numbers, even the latest numbers from Bart Watson, the economist up at Brewers Association, it's, I wouldn't say a grim picture, but it's almost grim. The sales are
it's interesting
soft.
because the numbers keep going up somehow. The number of breweries is still quite large. I think it's over 7,000 now, but
you're absolutely right. It's over. In fact, it peaked. I believe it peaked at close to 9,000 breweries.
Wow.
And the market share really never got to more than about, I think it was about 12%. So of the beer market. So when you have, 7,000 breweries competing for 12% of the beer market,
Yeah.
And at the same time, the 80% of the beer market is being controlled by, I don't know, a handful of brewers.
Couple companies. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just not. I don't know. The competition is just super competitive on the craft side, and
I can only
so
imagine.
so it's no wonder why there's just so many brewers, and some are making fantastic beers. Others make decent beers, but when sales are down and soft, it's like they have to really do whatever they can to stay in business.
Sure.
And it's so right now that's what they're doing. A lot of them are really really struggling, trying to figure out what to do. What's that next product they can make to bring in uh, funds so that they can keep the lights on. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we like to bash a lot of the large commercial brewers, particularly on the craft and homebrew side. But what are some of the things that homebrewers really can learn from the big breweries? I mean, you spent 32 years there.
Oh yeah. So I would argue that a lot of the home brewing methods, scientific methods, really owe a lot to the big brewers. So everything from when you get on what is it, BeerSmith and all the other apps, and
Yeah.
you come up with these formulas to calculate IBUs or HBUs, whatever you want to call them. All the hop knowledge, a lot of that came from the big brewers because they had to figure out how to make the hopping method as consistent as possible so that the net result is a product like Bud Light or Coors Light or Miller High Life that was consistent time after time, year after year,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the conditions that the hops came in at, because hops are a agricultural commodity that changes every year. Sometimes you've got great years where hops have a lot of alpha acids and they're just really good quality. Other times you've got years where the hop quality goes way down,
Mm-hmm.
but the science in brewing has proven out over the years so that you could make a consistent, good tasting beer, whether it's Miller High Life or Coors Banquet. And you can make it taste good year after year, regardless of if that hop quality goes up or down, or the malt quality. Barley, as you grow it, will come in different every year. Everything, I mean, all the characteristics, the quality characteristics of barley change, whether it's amount of extract or there's just so many things. The color, all just lots of characteristics, and brewers can take all that data, recalculate, reformulate, and come up with the same products year after year, which is hard to do. But when you take that knowledge to the homebrew side, you can apply it to do almost whatever you want in regards to bitterness, dry hopping, coming up with strong beers. In fact, I would argue that some of the real strong imperial ales really can trace their existence back to the early days of when the big brewers were doing high gravity brewing, which a lot of them still do to this day. But in the early years, I would say it was the 1980s or 70s
Mm-hmm.
when big brewers started doing the science to say, okay, our brewery is at capacity. How can we increase capacity without building a whole new brew hall? And so what they did was they said, well, let's try increasing the gravity, and then at the end of the process, you blend it down with brewing water to get twice as much volume, or whatever it is, 1.5 or twice, 2.5 times the volume, because you've started at a high gravity. And so brewers did that and would end up with beers at the end of aging that could be 7, 8, 9%
Mm-hmm.
by weight. So by the ABV would be multiply that by, I think it's 1.25. So you're talking brews that are up to 10 or 11% ABV. And so the big brewers got that behind there and did the science to figure out how to do that. So you have a real controlled ferment, and you don't have esters go crazy out of control and all that. And the net result is that knowledge base got passed down to brewers, craft brewers, and home brewers who could then say, "Wait a minute, You could take that same process and make an imperial form of IPA or an imperial form of stout or whatever, and you could do it in a way that the flavor is amplified, but in a good way, not a crazy way where esters go out of control and it just starts tasting terrible. And so, yeah, those are just a couple of things. And but I think there's a lot. If I've sat down over a beer with you, Brad, I think I could probably come up with a lot of different areas that homebrewers use. They can be traced back to the big brewers.
It is pretty amazing. I think we live in the golden age of homebrewing to a large degree because, you and I started in the 80s when we had really bad ingredients. We had mostly home-built equipment. We had, all this stuff. And now, you can go out for a few $100s and buy your stainless steel almost commercial quality equipment. You can buy top-of-the-line ingredients that are fresh and great. And of course, we have the knowledge now that we didn't have either. So all those kind of add up to really kind of amazing homebrews, really.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I would argue that today's homebrewers, some of them are making better quality beers than some of the craft beer you can find, and certainly better than some of the craft beer that you found in the 1990s and early 2000s. And it's all because, like you said, the quality of equipment, the quality of raw materials, and that knowledge, you put that together, and hard to argue that homebrews haven't gotten better and better. And I think they're on par with a lot of the craft beers that you pay good money for.
No doubt. Yeah, I've had some honestly mediocre craft beers that really don't measure up, but there are some really good ones out there too. Which brings me to my next topic. After you retired, you dived into a new brewery, I think about 4 years ago, by co-founding Syria. And how did that come about?
So by the time it was about 2017, Coors / Miller Coors / Molson Coors, they had a rule called the Rule of 85, which meant your age plus your years of service. If it equaled 85 or more, you could walk out the front door with pension, with health insurance, life insurance,
nice.
Access to the employee sales trailer to get free or cheap beer. All these little perks.
That's the biggest benefit, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. and it's like I reached that point, in creating Blue Moon, which is and was a $1 billion a year brand.
Wow.
That really kind of helped to grandfather me into that program, and it got to the point where I was able to walk out the front door, retire, walk out with a check for pension funds and all that, and but prior to that, my wife and I talked, and we said, I can retire and we can try to do something else, and she's an engineer, a civil engineer, and but her specialty is whatever, water and wastewater systems. So she really knew a lot about water and wastewater. And in fact, whenever I would travel for Blue Moon to launch it in a new country, we'd always stop to look at the water and wastewater systems from her point of view, because she'd love to see, what the brewers are using. And so she's been around brewing a long time and had a good feel for it. And that's when we started talking, saying, okay, maybe we start our own little brewery. And then by the time 2017 came around, there were, 5,000 breweries or 6,000. Yeah. And we said, well, maybe not a brewery directly, because we'd be competing against all these other breweries, and that'd be a little tough. And so we thought, okay, the other thing is that cannabis was made legal in Colorado in 2012.
Sure.
And so we thought, okay, well, maybe we could figure out how to make cannabis beer. And we don't like smoke. Very few of our friends like being around smoke. And we thought, okay, maybe we can make cannabis beer, because it then makes cannabis in a socially acceptable format.
Sure.
And we won't go too high with the strength of it, because we don't want to get people stoned. We want people to be responsible and enjoy themselves and still stay social.
Yeah.
And so we That's what we started out with, and I retired officially. We launched Syria, and I got to work right away. And the first thing we figured out was you cannot legally sell alcohol and cannabis in the same product in the United States, whether it's in cannabis legal states or otherwise. You just can't put the two ingredients together. And so I had to reach way back in my memory banks from the time I was in Belgium when they taught us how to make some really flavorful non-alcoholic beers. Because in Belgium, some of the brewing techniques date back to the First and Second World Wars, where their amount of brewing materials were restricted heavily.
Yeah.
And they had to brew with almost anything, and they had to make it taste somewhat drinkable. And so their creativity really had a heavy hand in creating these different things, these different drinks that were called beer, non-alcoholic beer. And they made some with alcohol too, but they made some really interesting things without alcohol. And so they taught us that in brewing school. And so I thought, okay, what was that they talked about? And so I had to recreate things. And we built on our property here in Colorado, we built we have a couple acres and some outbuildings, and one of the outbuildings is a garage, and we converted it into an office with a pilot brewery with a 2-barrel capacity. I went to up in Cleveland is Brew Magic, Sabco.
Sure.
And so I got there at that time. They had just come out with a 2-barrel kind of a pilot brewery system that was geared towards professionals or really serious homebrewers. And I thought that would make it the perfect size for a pilot facility. So I got one of those and got stainless steel tanks, 2-barrel tanks, a glycol chiller, a big one, plate heat exchanger, CO2 system, and just everything to make it a fully outfitted pilot brewery. And I got to work making recipes, NA recipes, and then figured out right away that there's really 4 different ways you can make non-alcoholic beer.
Sure. I was going to ask you if you could walk through, how you're doing it. I've had people on discussing the topic before, and there are a number of methods they can use. So go ahead.
So the 4 different ways that you can create beer without alcohol are, you can divide them up into 2 general sections or two divisions. One is the kind of the biological side, and then the other is the mechanical side. So on the biological side, the easiest way that most brewers make non-alcoholic beer is to use arrested fermentation, where you create the recipe. You shoot for a lower end gravity, a lower starting and finishing gravity than you would normally. Right. So that there's very minimal fermentation that takes place, and then you stop it when it reaches 0.5% and spin the yeast out, and then generally you pasteurize to stabilize it, and then that's non-alcoholic beer, and that's what most craft brewers do. And then the other way is to use some of these specialty yeasts, these new yeasts that don't ferment maltose or maltotriose. And so what you do there is you mash a little bit warmer to minimize the formation of glucose and maximize the formation of maltose and maltotriose and dextrins. And then by doing that, these specialty yeasts will just ferment that little bit of glucose, and in general, it'll be about 0.5% or less. And so that's the second biological way. And then the third pseudo-biological way is to make a really low alcohol beer, a session beer, and then to just add brewing water, brewing hot liquor to it, or sterile cold liquor, and just get that gravity way down, or the alcohol down to that 0.5%. And for your listeners that may not be familiar with the TTB or the regulations around low alcohol beer, the governmental regulatory agency that oversees brewers and in fact winemakers and distillers is called the TTB. It's the successor to the old ATF. The Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was reformed, and so now you've got the Division of Alcohol, Tax and Trade Bureau, and they actually have a listing of the legal definitions for beer.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we call beer uh, legally has to have more than 0.5% alcohol by volume.
Mm-hmm.
And the upper limit, there is really no upper limit, but it's got to be more than 0.5%. And it has to have a minimum of 7.5 pounds of hops per 100 finished barrels.
Hmm. That
So those are
doesn't sound like a high hop rate to me, but
no, but that's the minimum. And it could have the sky's the limit as to how many hops you want to put in. But
yeah.
those are the two things that a beer must have to legally be called a beer. In the amount of malt. In the guidelines, it really is kind of unclear as to how much malt versus other grains and other fermentables. But the two things that are really crystal clear are 0.5% ABV or more and 7.5 pounds of hops per 100 finished barrels.
Sure.
Then you could legally call it beer. Now, on the low end of the alcohol side, they allow you to call a beer a low alcohol or LA beer if it has no more than 2.5% ABV, all the way down to 0.5. So 0.5 up to 2.5, you can call it an LA beer, low alcohol.
Okay.
Now, when it's below 0.5 down to 0.01, that is any measurable amount, all the way up to 0.5, you have to call it non-alcoholic malt beverage or near beer. Most people choose NA, non-alcoholic malt beverage.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last classification is if the government, with their machinery and their alcohol measurement capacity, if they cannot measure any detectable alcohol in the product, so in other words, 0.00, then they allow you to call it AF, alcohol free. And so now let's go back to those methods of making these beers. With arrested fermentation, it's virtually impossible to get alcohol free. So those are all, for practical purposes, they're all NAs, non-alcoholic beer. Mm-hmm. Same with the unique yeast strains. And these unique yeast strains, I mentioned earlier genetically modified things and that, but these are not genetically modified. These unique strains are strains that have been found, for example, on rotting fruit and rotting vegetables. Mm-hmm. And these are natural non-brewing yeasts, and they don't ferment maltose or maltotriose, and they've just been isolated by these yeast companies.
Sure.
Then they have a slightly different flavor profile than brewer's yeast, but they do the job. Bottom line, though, also is they won't make 0.0 beer. They'll make NA. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go to the other side of the coin and look at these mechanical methods, there are two major ones. One is vacuum distillation, and the other one is reverse osmosis.
Sure.
And so with vacuum distillation, that one will allow you to get down to 0.00 because you can pull out every last drop of beer. Because when you the way that works is at the end of the brewing process, when you have a finished beer, you put it in the vacuum distillation unit, goes into a big tank. It goes under a vacuum. And what happens is the boiling point of alcohol drops. So rather than 173 degrees Fahrenheit is the boiling point of alcohol normally at standard conditions. Under a vacuum, it can drop as low as about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you warm it up to 70, which is pretty much little warmer than room temperature. You see the alcohol just boiling off like crazy. It boils off, and you could collect it or put it down the drain, whatever you want. But it just boils off, and you can just keep that up until the alcohol is completely down to 0.00, or you can stop it when it's somewhere between 0.01 all the way up to 0.5. So
is that the method you're using then?
It's the method we used to use. We purchased a vacuum distillation unit, and they are very expensive. They can run in price anywhere from $250,000 on up to $1 million. And,
wow.
So they're very expensive, and for small brewers, you can make some decent products with them, but it's hard to be profitable quickly because just the sheer cost of that machinery is so high.
Sure.
It takes a long time for you to recoup all those costs. But yes, you can make some decent product, and we were using one for the first 2 years of our existence.
So we're running a little bit low on time, but can you explain what method you're using now?
Well, we developed a proprietary new method for making 000 beer, and so now we are able to make what we call a full flavored, full bodied NA beer, or AF beer, using our new proprietary method. And we do come in at 000, and the government has measured zero alcohol, so they've given us permission. And we're one of a handful of brewers in the U.S. that makes alcohol free. Us, Heineken Zero, and Bud Zero make 000 AF beer. Mm-hmm. And there is one craft brewer up in Minnesota, Hairless Dog, that also makes AF beer, but they really focus on their low calorie count, which I believe is like 10 calories. So their beer is, by nature, it's going to be a lot thinner than what I would expect. It's not a bad beer. It's just very thin. And if you're looking for a very low calorie option, that's a decent craft product. But if you want something with the aroma, the taste, the body, the flavor of a craft beer, that's where our process allows us to do that at 000. So that's how we do it. We can't talk extensively about how we do it because it is proprietary, but I guess it's a radical new way of making beer.
Nice.
And so it works really well for us. And that last way of mechanically making NA beer is reverse osmosis, where you use high pressure and push beer through a series of membranes mm-hmm. to basically filter out the alcohol. Mm-hmm. And that's another way. It's very difficult to get down to 000 with reverse osmosis. You can do it with multiple passes, but it also involves a lot of water usage and energy usage, time, yes. And so the net effect is that one is best at making NA, and that's why most of these beers out there in the marketplace produced by craft brewers are NA products. Very, very few, in fact, 2 that are AF, mm-hmm. and we're one of them. And for us, we pride ourselves on the ability to make alcohol-free craft beer.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I wanted to give you a minute to talk about Syria. I know you have a pretty broad distribution. Where can people find your products? Where can they learn more about your products? You are one of the bigger non-alcoholic beer brewers in the country, I think, at this point, right?
For craft beer, yeah. The biggest one would be Athletic. They have just passed everybody up because they make a decent product. They're NA, mm-hmm. and they have decent funding behind them. And so they're able to really get across the country and spend to market their products. I'm a brewer. I'm not an ex-fund manager or a hedge fund trader the way that they are. But right. So for me, it's more difficult to raise money. But we are in 20 states mm-hmm. and Puerto Rico. We're nationwide in Total Wine. So if there's a Total Wine store near you, that's through them. We're nationwide, but through regular beer distributors, we're in 20 states, and we're also available direct to consumer because since we don't have alcohol, not even a trace of alcohol. In fact, we say one ripe banana has more alcohol than a case of our beer. So we're able to go direct to consumer, whether it's Amazon or any of your favorite shopping sites.
Oh, nice.
And we ship to most states. There's just a handful of states we don't ship to because of their local laws. But all our products are pasteurized, so they're safe to consume. You won't see the can starting to bulge out if you keep it in your warm pantry, which that's one thing I'm a proponent of is really, really making sure that craft brewers, if they're making NA beers, they've got to pasteurize to keep the product safe for consumers. So it doesn't re-ferment and become alcoholic, or worse, support the growth of something like E. coli if a E. coli cell got in during packaging mm-hmm. and starts growing. So you want to make sure that those products are absolutely safe for the end user, and that's why Ours are all pasteurized, but there are some products out there that are not pasteurized. And for those brewers, I'm not going to name any of them, but for those brewers, I always advise them to please pasteurize so we don't see any people get sick or worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And your website, where you can find it.
Yeah, so we're on. We've got Syria Instagram, Syria Facebook, and our Syria website. Syria Infused for the cannabis site, mm-hmm. which tells you where our cannabis beers are located, and then Syria NA for our alcohol-free site, and tells you. There's a store locator and all that, and gives kind of the history of our brands and everything. But yeah, just Google Syria Brewing, and it'll take you right to any of those.
And that's Syria with a C for folks that are listening to the audio version, right?
Yeah, Brad, you're absolutely right. Syria with a C, yeah. Ceria, and pronounced. It rhymes with area. Syria Brewing Company, and just search for us on the web, and you'll find our different sites, and you can find out more about us.
Awesome. Well, Keith, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'd love to have you back again and talk about it again in a few months, talk about some of your experiences with your craft brewing. And we never even got to the cannabis infused portion, but which I know you wrote a book on. But I do appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much for being here, Keith.
Brad, thank you so much for having me on. I hope your listeners have learned a few little nuggets that they can take back to their little home breweries pot and start experimenting and having some fun with. And yeah, and like you said, I would be happy to come back and talk more about NA brewing for the home brewer specifically. And if people want it, we can talk about how to make home brewed cannabis beer.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to have you back. We can talk about, like you said, the home brewing techniques that apply here. But today my guest was Dr. Keith Villa, co-founder of Syria Brewing and retired brewmaster for Blue Moon. Thank you again, Keith.
Thanks, Brad. Cheers.
A big thank you to Keith Villa for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith forum a few weeks ago, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.